If you want to have lovely decorative lettering in your journal, but your handwriting leaves a lot to be desired, and you don't have the time, effort, and energy to spend becoming a master calligrapher, then printed headers could be the solution you're looking for. This is the primary way that I like to do my headers in my journal now, mainly because it lets me use a bunch of different lettering styles without having to spend a whole heap of time figuring out how to do that style and then getting it into my journal. In this video, we're going to go through how to find the lettering styles, how to size them appropriately, and then what to print them on so that you can get them looking great. But where this process always starts is considering my theme for the month. I normally like to use lettering styles in my journal to really lean into that theme and bring in another decorative element that brings the theme to life. Obviously, monthly themes is not something you need to have, but if you're going with, say, a circus theme, then leaning into like a carnival or circus type font is just another way to bring that decoration to your layouts. If you're doing something very soft and whimsical, then you probably don't want to go in with a really heavy and bold lettering style. Or maybe you do, because juxtaposition is nice as well. Once we figure out the kind of vibe we're going for with the lettering style though, then it's time to find a font that matches. While there are plenty of fonts that come preloaded onto your computer, I'm often looking for something a little bit more fancy than Aptos, Times New Roman, or Calibri. Thankfully, there are great free font resources online that we can use, my favorites being defont.com or 1001fonts.com, both of those being linked in the description box below for you. While we could spend a huge amount of time just scrolling this website and collecting different lettering styles, and I definitely do that, especially on 1001 fonts, where if you make yourself a login, you can save your favorites for later. But rather than getting ourselves completely overwhelmed looking at every single lettering style they have on there, because they have like upwards of 50,000, instead we can use their different font categories to find styles that are going to be better suited for what we're looking for. Another reason why 1001 fonts is typically the one that I lean towards is that on the main screen you can type in example text so you can see what any given lettering style will look like for your headers. Because I often want to use numbers in my headers, I want to make sure that whatever font I pick actually has numbers loaded, and those numbers look good. Once you've found your lettering style that you like though, then we just need to download it and install it to our computer. If you're on a Windows computer, this is just done by right-clicking on the font file and then pressing install, but if you're on a Mac, then you need to double-click the font file and then press the install font button. If you get stuck with that step though, there are helpful tutorials online that actually show you that process. Now as the font is installed though, it's time to get started on setting up our headers. To make mine, I use Microsoft Word, and so jumping into there, I want to make sure that my document is set up appropriately. This means going over to the Layout tab, setting the page size to be the same size as the paper I'll be printing on. For me that's A4, but you might need to change it to letter size or whatever paper you're going to be using. This means that any of the measuring that we do later is going to be accurate. While I'm here, I'll also set the margins of the paper. I like mine to be pretty small because my printer can print pretty close to the edge of the page, and I want to make sure that I'm maximizing the space on the page for those headers. I get pretty particular about not wasting any of my sticker paper. Now as the document is ready though, it's time to think about what headers we need. The typical ones that I make sure to include are any headers for each individual collection I'm setting up, so whether that be like a monthly calendar, or any trackers, any of my weekly logs, because I like to use headers on those weekly dashboards, any subheaders that I'm going to need for any of those collections. So for instance, on my tracker, do I need to have a key? Do I need to have any column headers? Do I need any section headers or anything like that? For instance, on my weekly dashboards, I need a routines header, a priorities header, a task list header, and also a meal plan header. And then outside of this, I also like to print off headers for each of my daily logs. So thinking about all of the days that I'm going to be capturing in this setup in particular, whether they be just from 1 month in question or either side, just depending on how many weekly logs I'm setting up in this style. I also typically like to include some bonus headers just so that I have them if I want to make a little collection somewhere in amongst my daily logs. So for instance, an ideas list, thoughts, notes, a section for any migrated tasks, a mind unwind or brain dump, and I'll also think about whether I have any specialty projects that I might want to set aside a space for, so typing up headers for those as well. Once we've got all the headers typed up though, it's time to change them to the font that we want and then size them appropriately so they're going to fit in our journal. For this we do need to pre-decide how much space we want each of the headers to take up or what space we want them to fit within, but a very good place to start is the width of your journal. We don't want any header to go further than that width unless it's going to be going across a double page spread, or unless you don't mind stacking your header so it goes across 2 lines. Because I typically use the same spacing in my journal every time I set up, I've gotten pretty familiar with mine. I know that I want any main page header to take up either 1.5 or 2 centimeters vertically and go no wider than the width of the journal, which in an A5 for me is typically 13 centimeters. For any subheaders that I'm going to be using on the bulk of the page though, most of the time I will structure my layouts so that they fit into 2 separate columns on any given page, with each of those columns being 6 centimeters across in an A5, so I don't want any of the subheaders to go wider than that. Normally, for the sake of simplicity, I also don't want them to be any taller than 1 centimeter. The exact spacing very much depends on the structure of the layouts you're making though, so take time to pre-plan your layout, think about where you want things to fit within, and consider how much space you want them to take up. Once we know those spacings though, then we need to figure out if these headers are actually going to fit in them. The way that I typically do this is using a guess and check model. And no, this does not mean printing out heaps and heaps of copies of my headers until I get the right sizing. Instead, what I do is jump over into the Insert menu and then into the Shapes drop-down tab. From here, I can insert a box, just a regular rectangular box, and the specific size of it at the start doesn't really matter because I'm going to size it appropriately to the amount of space I want any given header to take up. On the Shape Format tab, I can size those using the Height and Width section, and once I have the size set, then I like to go and fill the box with no color. This just leaves me with an outline that I can use as a guide to see which of my headers are going to fit into that spacing versus which ones aren't. Typically, I'll go and take this to be aligned with whichever header is going to be my largest one, or has the most letters, or takes up the most width, and then I'll change the size of the font so that it fits within this box. This is where the guess and check kind of approach comes in. I don't necessarily know straight off the bat what size lettering I'm going to need, especially because different fonts are going to be different sizes. Just because I use a size 24 in one lettering style doesn't mean it's a 24 for every lettering style. Sometimes we have hanging letters, sometimes there are flourishes, sometimes things are just wider, but setting myself up a reference box that is the exact sizing I'll have in my journal means that I can pick the right font size for any given font. Once I'm happy with the sizing of my main page headers, then I'll go and do the same process for my subheaders and my daily headers, just making sure to change the sizing of that reference box so it's only 1 centimeter tall, because that's my preference, and 6 centimeters across if it's going to be in a half-page column on my layout. Once all of the headers are sized appropriately for getting them to fit into my layouts, then I want to make sure that they are arranged appropriately on the page. In particular, I want to look at any of the headers that come with 2 words or more, and making sure that they are all on the same line, mainly because I want to be able to cut them out as an individual sticker piece and stick them all in at once, rather than having to cut out separate words and stick them in separately. The main place that I look for this is in the daily log headers, because I usually use the day name and a number, and I don't want the number and the day name to be on separate lines. I definitely get just a little bit particular here, trying to make sure I'm making the best use of the page, so I'll rearrange those headers so that they fit in as best as they can. If I have any extra space at the bottom, that's where I'll go and add in those extra headers we talked about, so things like ideas, mind unwind, notes, thoughts, life admin, whatever is going to be useful for me in that month in particular. But once you're happy that you have all of the headers that you need and the arrangement of them is going to make them easier to use, then it's time to print them off. When it comes to printing my headers, there are 2 main types of sticker paper I use. One of them either being like a washi or vellum kind of sticker paper, which means that when I cut things out and stick them into the journal, the paper that hasn't been printed on really blends quite nicely into the background. This is my personal preference for any kind of standalone letters that I'm not going to print with a background, but for some lettering styles, like the one we have here, which has the black box behind the text, on those ones I just use a regular matte white sticker paper. The 2 in particular that I like to use are linked in the description box, but I know that people also like to use the brand Online Labels if it's accessible to them, or I also know people go with the Avery transparent paper if they're still looking for a transparent background. We just want to load this into our printer though, making sure that it is the appropriate way around. For me, I have to have the top of the sticker paper facing down in the printer tray, but it might be different for the printer you're using. If you're curious, the printer that I use is the Epson EcoTank. I've really enjoyed it. That one's also linked in the description box, but whatever printer you already have is probably fine. When it comes to the actual printing process though, I always make sure to go into the printer properties and check that the document size hasn't changed, because if it's different to the printer paper that I'm using, then all of those sizing and measurements that I just did is kind of going to go to waste. In here I'll also check the quality. If I'm printing on the vellum, I usually just go with standard because I don't want it to put too much ink down, but if I'm going with the matte white paper, I usually change this to high because it can handle having more ink on it. Once I'm happy with those settings though, it's then just time to print them off. Once the headers are printed, you can get kind of fancy and use specialty tools to try and cut them out, but honestly, I usually just go in with scissors, especially because I typically use that vellum sticker paper. It doesn't really matter if my cutting is a little bit skew if cattywampus. I normally just cut the headings out in kind of amorphous blobs that fit the lettering specifically as well as it can, not leaving too much overhang of the blank sticker paper. Once they're cut out though, then all we need to do is stick them into our journal in the appropriate spots. While there are definitely more high-tech and fancy ways to do this, like using cutting machines and specialty programs and such, this is the style that I use every single time I want to print headers for my journal, which is essentially twice a month because I use this in my regular journal and also my reading journal. Another thing that I love to print off and stick into my journal are book covers, and we have a separate video talking about the process for that one, which goes through Microsoft Office, Google Docs, and Canva, and how you can use those to size your covers appropriately and print them off for your journal too. If that's something you're interested in, then that video is the next one to check out, so click or tap on that one and I'll see you over there.